Good day, and welcome to Glasnost, where we talk about world politics, but we talk about it in terms of world history, and big ideas are welcome here. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. Today, the war in Ukraine is in its 84th day, and we're wondering how it's all going to end. We're especially wondering what Russia is thinking. And usually, the way this question is asked, we ask what Vladimir Putin is thinking. It all becomes an exercise in Putinology. But maybe we can also ask the question in a different way. We can ask whether Russian experts and other Russian elites are people who we have to consult in order to get a feel for Russian sensibilities about national interest. And for this, we turn today to Andrei Tsygankov, who studies Russian foreign policy and Russian nationalism. Professor Tsygankov is especially interested in the debates that go on among Russian intellectuals and in Russian elites. He's professor of political science and international relations at San Francisco State University. He's written many books and articles in the last 20 years. His work has appeared in periodicals in the United States and also in Russia as well. And his latest book is Russian Realism, Defending Derzhava in International Relations. The book is published by Routledge and is available on Amazon. Makes a nice gift. So let's ask Professor Tsygankov about Russian Derzhava, which I translate as power or great power status, something like that. We'll ask him to tell us more about that. Great power status and Russian realism. So welcome, Professor Tsygankov.
Thank you so much for having me. Well, this book is, as you described, about the notion of Derzhava as developed by Russian thinkers several centuries ago. And realism specifically stresses the idea of national security, the idea of sovereignty and power in international relations. I am a scholar of international relations theory, of ideas, so I am interested in this from this particular perspective. Russian realism that stresses the notion of Derzhava is not fundamentally different from Western realism. And Western realism, as you know, you must be teaching this yourself. For those of you who continue to teach international relations, history, certainly are familiar with the so-called geopolitical thinking, geopolitical theories. And this is different from traditional imperialism on the one hand, and more modern theories of liberalism, Marxism that stress either global institutions and human rights and democracy or some fundamental economic differences and race and others. So here, Russian realism is not fundamentally different from the Western type. What makes Russian realism is different is simply the defense of Russia's national interests, the defense of what it believes is specific to Russia. And here, of course, it is fundamentally defensive because it views Russia not on the top of the global power hierarchy, but fighting to survive against powerful pressures from the West and other major powers. And that's where the notion of Derzhava comes in, which is central to Russian realism, because the Derzhava is not an empire per se, even though Russia historically has been an empire, but it's a stress on particular institutions, particular values that Russia must protect from potential threats from the outside. And those institutions include the notion of strong state system, because if Russia is trying to catch up with more advanced, economically advanced powers, then it must have some ways to mobilize resources. It must have some developmental projects, ideas in mind. And that's where the strong state comes in. The idea of justice that comes from Eastern Christianity is also important here. And then, as you mentioned, of course, status. Status, and not just status, but military capabilities of a major power, great power, and protection of those who gravitate towards Russia outside. That's what the notion of Держава historically combines, and it continues to change depending on what we are discussing. The Soviet era, of course, had different attributes. Post-Soviet era fundamentally changed as well, but there is still continuity in this idea of Держава. That's what I'm trying to describe in the book, and the idea of Russian realism is quite different, I should explain, from two other big ideas in Russia. And I'm writing a trilogy. This is just the first book in this trilogy about Russian realism. Two other books are coming, and these books will then describe two other alternative ideas. One of them is liberal idea. Russia has its own westernizers, those who believe that Russia development must come as a project of catching up with the West by embracing Western values and ideas. So this project is about change, is about Russian domestic change. And the third alternative idea is the idea of Russia as a local civilization and empire. The Russian idea is more complex, but very often it incorporates the notion of empire, the notion of Russia as a Eurasia, the notion of Russia as a particular kind of Slavophile community. All these ideas are also going to be considered in a separate volume. So that's where realism is only just the first volume in this series. And as I said, it's largely defensive, and there are multiple schools here. We can discuss those schools as well, but there are three fundamentally different schools within Russian realism. They have different influences, historical influences, intellectual influences. And because realism sees itself as principally different from imperialism, it has experienced a revival after the Soviet collapse. The old Soviet imperial idea, communism as an ideology, were no longer in place. So this is where Russia had a choice of somehow to try to integrate with the West, or try to recover as a major power with some interest in the West, but also with some political independence. And because Russia was in disarray, as you remember, in the 90s, it went through really tough times in terms of economic collapse, rising crime, the disintegration and ethnic conflicts. There was always a notion of instability and vacuum of ideas and power. And that notion, that vacuum was filled increasingly by those who believed in the ideas of Russia as an independent state and as a great power. That's where realism made a comeback. Specifically due to some influences of intellectuals, organizations such as the Council of Foreign Relations, Foreign and Defense Policy, it's called in Russia, which is modeled after the American Council on Foreign Relations. Evgeny Primakov, who was the second foreign minister of Russia, is another major influence and contributed to the rise of Russian realism. So as of now, this is the mainstream as you can get. This is the fundamental center of Russian foreign policy thinking. You have the dominant schools in Russia, dominant think tanks, centers of thinking in Moscow, St. Petersburg, some other places that I've had a chance to visit, that give their tribute, give their due to realism and see themselves as realists in this world. And certainly the relationships with the West, all these issues that we have been discussing with respect to Ukraine, are very much in the center of these people who are interested in analyzing the world affairs through the prism of realism, Western realism and Russian realism at the same time. And this is where the significance comes in. We must do better to understand Russian thinking. As you rightly pointed out, there is no book about Russian realism, as far as I know. This is the first one, and it has practical implications as well, because Vladimir Putin, we can talk about Putin as well, but certainly with some reservations, caveats that we need to discuss, really thinks as a fundamentally quintessentially realist. A particular school within Russian realism that thinks that the emphasis should be on prioritizing national security and containing the West globally, if possible, because the West is a global power and we cannot be secure until we find a way somehow to deter the West. That's where Putin comes in.
Well, and suppose we pursue a couple of those points. A couple of them I think are well worth pursuing. First, the geopolitical setting, and then the question of values, the whole notion of whether there's a Russian idea that is tied in with the Russian church and orthodoxy and the rest of that. And the third, maybe let's see, the geopolitics of the whole idea. Let me ask you about the geopolitics of the whole idea. Angelo Tosca, the Italian socialist back in the 20s, when they were talking about the idea of socialism in one country, whether the Russian Revolution could be limited, he said, you know, we're talking about Russia as if it were a state, but Russia is not a state, he said, it's a continent. That is to say, Russia can't be judged in terms of a national interest that would compare to any other country's national interest, because it is, it's got a kind of a stretch over the whole world island. So he was introducing, I suppose, the idea of what some Russian scholars in the 20s called Eurasianism and the rest of that. Do you think that cuts against the idea that Russia can only have a local or regional national interest? Doesn't Russia necessarily have to be a power with world influence?
Yes and no, Tony, because this idea of Eurasianism is in fact quite local. The idea that Russia must dominate a particular landmass, the idea that Russia has its cultural allies, those who somehow gravitate towards Russia geographically, culturally, ethnically, and politically, is also quite limited rather than global. And therefore the appeal, and that's a traditional appeal of the Russian Empire too, is limited to those who are in the regional, so to speak. The question is how you define that region. Where do you set boundaries? Some contemporary Russian Eurasianists indeed have global ambitions, but they are a minority and they are not really in the mainstream. People such as Alexander Dugin, for example, who is quite influential in some circles and actually quite well known for his work that is voluminous in the West, argue that actually Russia is the only way to defeat global Atlanticism, as he calls it. So he sees Eurasianism in terms of opposition to sea-based powers. Russia is a land-based power, therefore is well positioned to be global if it aligns itself with some other land-based powers, such as Germany and perhaps China, even though he is no fan of China. So that is one global way of thinking about Eurasianism, but it really is quite obscure. Predominantly in the mainstream, Russian classical Eurasianism is merely establishing Russia-Turkic unity, has roots also in Orthodox Christianity and an alliance that historically they believe Russia built with Mongols by way of having very close relationships under the Mongols. They developed mentality of Mongols. They became more like Asian in their mentality and their political system. And therefore, it makes sense for them to build their new Eurasian autocracy that is quite limited in geographic reach. And it still has somehow to appeal to Orthodox Christians, to those who have issues, different kinds of issues with the Western Atlanticist political system. Therefore, it's limited and global depending on whom you ask, and contemporary Russian Eurasianists are actually also quite diverse. You have at least 3 different groups, and only one of them is committed to this global idea that I just described to you. They call themselves neo-Eurasianists. But two others are either defenders of the old classical tradition of Russian Eurasianism, people such as Nikolai Trubetskoy, Pyotr Savitsky, Lev Karsavin, those who immigrated from Russia after the revolution and built their intellectual homes in Paris on the one hand and Prague on the other. So that's where they promoted the idea of Russia as Eurasia. And they have plenty of supporters today because to some extent they continue to exist in Russian mind even throughout the Soviet times. One of the most prominent scholar and student was the son of famous poet Anna Akhmatova and another famous poet Gumilev, Nikolai Gumilev. So their son Lev Gumilev became a very active promoter of Eurasianist ideas, and he is awfully popular in today's Russia as well. So that's the second camp. And the third camp is even more mainstream today, and it's associated with the idea of the greater Eurasia outside the former Soviet boundaries, built in alliance and partnership with China, with Turkey, with Iran, with all those countries that are willing to contribute to this space, the relatively commercially open space, with participation of different civilizations, with one condition, that the United States will not be a part of it. So this greater Eurasian space is yet another more mainstream version of Eurasianism, also regionally limited rather than global, but potentially, certainly economically, politically powerful counterweight to the United States because they already have institutions. They have not only Eurasian Economic Union that is limited to Russia and several post-Soviet states, but they also have prominently the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a multilateral institution and venue for consultation, mutually interesting projects for Russia, China, even India now is a member, and Pakistan is as well. Iran is admitted. So potentially, this is yet another incarnation of Eurasianism, if you will.
Well, when you talk about Russia as a Eurasian power, are you saying it's not a Western power? That's the problem, and it confronts us on two levels. How does Russia plug into the traditional ideas we have about great powers, which are essentially European, have to do with the history of the balance of power in Europe? Right. And secondly, the ideological side of it, the model, the Russian model. How can you have a model that is European, that is based on religion, on a religious ideology?
Well, on the first question, whether Russia is anti-European, it also depends on whom you ask. If you ask Dugin and many of Gumilev's supporters, then the answer most certainly is going to be in the affirmative. And they will have ideological justification why Russia is not European. And this goes back all the way to the 19th century Slavophile thought, actually even late Slavophile thought, because the early Slavophiles saw themselves as Russia being a member of a European family, Russia just being a better European, Russia being superior in some of its values to Europe, but still European. But the late Slavophiles, many of them, people such as Lamansky, Vladimir Lamansky, Nikolai Danilevsky, they thought of Russia as a really anti-European cultural type. They argued that Russia is simply very different ethnically and culturally from what Europe is, and therefore we must break from Europeans, and we can never be integrated with Europeans. We can have normal kind of relationships, but our values, our heart, our ideas are elsewhere. We are not Europeans. That's the argument that Danilevsky first made. He published a book called Russia in Europe, I believe in 1869, way before Samuel Huntington. way before Spengler, even with his idea of the decline of the West. And that's the idea that Eurasianists embraced. Certainly Trubetskoy was influenced by it, certainly Savitsky was influenced by it. Even leftist, left Eurasianists such as Subchinsky and Karsavin were very much influenced by this. So they embraced the idea that somehow Russia is anti-Europe. But some of the modern Eurasianists, people who argue this notion of the Greater Eurasia, are quite different. They believe that Eurasia actually includes Western Europe. And Europe, therefore, is just one particular part of the Greater Eurasia. It's just too bad that Europeans are not sensitive to their own strategic interests, that they are under the United States today. But sooner or later, this will have to change. They will then appreciate the role of Russia. They will build stronger economic and energy-based relationships with Russians. They will need somehow to build stronger relationships with Asia as well. And if you want to build transportation networks, then what is the shortest route? It is, of course, through Russia. So you have multiple rationales here: economic, energy-based, transport-based rationales, and politically too. The idea is not, for these people, the idea is not to necessarily build walls with Europe, but it is ultimately to make sure that the United States is not able to influence this development in this particular region in any meaningful way, because it's the US that is the source of all the troubles in this region, not Europe. And we can handle our relationships with Europe. In fact, if it wasn't for US interference, we would have been able to have relatively normal relationships with Europeans already. Or so goes the argument.
When you say Europeans, though, you're not saying all Europeans. You're probably saying you probably could have, the Russians could probably have good relations with Germany and with France backing Germany, the EU, the Normandy format group, the Normandy group, but not so much with Poland.
Not so much with Poland, not so much with Britain for sure. Yeah. Not so much with the Baltic states, not so much with those who are actually
perhaps now Sweden,
former Soviet bloc. Right now, Sweden is an interesting story. Finland is an interesting story, as you hear today, even from Vladimir Putin. Russia has no problems with Finland or Sweden as long as they do not build military bases and potentially offensive military capabilities on their territory.
But what would NATO mean but that?
That's the question. That's the question. If you want to keep Ukraine out of NATO for that reason, then it really is difficult to accept the same argument that you're making, just in reverse with respect to Finland and Sweden. This sounds like a justification when you do not have the capacity to influence these developments. Because clearly Russia has issues with this, and you have already some disagreements in the political class. Because while Putin says that potentially presents no problem for Russia, his foreign minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia say that actually a surprise is coming. A major development of military technical nature is coming, and it will unpleasantly surprise Finland. So Russians are preparing a response. The question is what kind of response it will be, but certainly they're not going to accept the idea of Finland and Sweden in NATO without granting any opposition to it, without any response. What kind of response it will be, we can speculate, but there will be some response.
Well, that is not a pleasant thought.
That is not going to be similar to the response that Putin initiated or did in Ukraine, but it's likely to be military buildup. It's likely to be perhaps deployment of strategic weapons. It's likely to be additional steps to reinforce Russian presence in the region by way of containing potential arsenals of NATO, because Russian military doctrine says that Russia will not necessarily respond in kind. It will not be symmetrical response, but if it is threatened fundamentally, then it may resort to more heavy types of military response. And in the worst case scenario, even nuclear weapons can be used. That is not going to be certainly reasoned in this case of Sweden and Finland, but some response by way of military deployment is what I think is likely to happen.
Well, as long as the subject has come up, we have to, in my opinion, we have to wrestle with it. The whole question of Russia's use of nuclear weapons. So when we think of Russia's use of nuclear weapons, frequently this is treated in the United States, I'm sad to say, in kind of propaganda terms. And frequently you get the argument that comes right back that Russia's not going to risk the use of nuclear weapons because they don't want a confrontation with the United States. But when you think of actual use of nuclear weapons to deal with a political situation, you think of them used in a small way, in a demonstrative way, in a tactical way. You don't think of threatening an all-out nuclear exchange with a superpower. You think of some other kind of use of nuclear weapons. This is a very frank question. Do you think the Russians are actually contemplating the tactical use, the demonstrative use of nuclear weapons now for this or that political advantage? And do you think that there's a realistic expectation that these can have an effect?
I don't, Tony. I don't think that Russians at this point are entertaining somehow this idea, but we have to think about this. We as analysts cannot exclude this because oftentimes we can miscalculate when it comes to strategic intentions of Russian policymakers, and because also the notion of existential threat, the way it is constructed, can be read and defined broadly. The Russian military doctrine says that NATO, that nuclear weapons can only be used in response to an existential threat posed to Russia by foreign powers. Essentially, it means that if Russia is attacked by nuclear weapons or by other overwhelming power, and it has no other options to protect its own existential values, its own existence, then as a last resort, it may use nuclear weapons. So this is where you have the notion of existential threat, and that notion actually can be expanded. That's where the problem lies. On the one hand, Russia can only use it when it is attacked by another power's major weapons. On the other hand, what if Russia is losing badly on the battlefield, let's say in Ukraine? What if it perceives that it is fighting a war not with Ukraine, and actually this is now the mainstream perception, but it is fighting the war with NATO and with the United States? What if it perceives that through Ukraine, the United States wants to strip Russia not only of what it has gained already in Ukraine, but also of its major power status, of its political system, of its statehood? If that is the way Russian authorities will read it, then we cannot exclude this, can we? We have to take it into consideration. The chances for that are quite small at this point. The likelihood is very low, but we still have to take it into consideration.
Well, don't we have to think of it in terms of the decision to go to war? When I
Yes.
think of an existential threat, that's what's involved.
Right.
And Putin has already reacted to something that he considered an existential threat.
Right.
Otherwise, he would not be in Ukraine.
That's the problem. That's the problem. Once you have, and we have at this point, we have a potential for escalation. Once you have this getting out of control, once you have some other powers somehow getting involved, we have a discussion of no-fly zone in the United States. Polls on several occasions propose somehow their involvement in Western Ukraine. We have some strange developments taking place in Moldova. A couple of weeks ago, some attacks on Russian military facilities in Transnistria, with NATO troops mobilizing on the Romanian side. So things may get out of hand. And if NATO somehow is involved, or if the United States, for example, provides Ukraine with major capabilities to not only fight back against Russia in Ukraine, but actually to launch major missiles on the Russian proper territory, with the capabilities of reaching some Russian targets 300 miles away from Ukraine, then it will be entirely different story. It will be entirely different ball game. And in that case, Russia will certainly escalate further. And there are multiple possibilities in which Russia can escalate. And within that range of Russia's potential escalation, there is a possibility of tactical nuclear weapons being used, but only again as a last resort. Because before that point is reached, Russia still has multiple choices. Its army is only probably 30% involved in Ukraine. The main capacity is not yet activated in the Ukrainian battlefield. Russia has not used mass mobilization. It has not, as you know, officially announced war against Ukraine. It has not chosen to use, for example, Kiev and government facilities as its targets. It has not used what we call sometimes carpet bombing against big Ukrainian cities. So this is why, by the way, Russians call it not a war, but a military operation, special military operation. So there is still a potential for escalation. And things must go really bad and very bad within a very foreseeable future before Russia will ever consider this nuclear option, which is why my answer is basically no. I think the likelihood is very low.
As long as we're on this topic, let's pursue it beyond a typical academic discussion and think of it as, you know, we're a couple of human beings worried about the destruction of the world. Do you think that it is possible to make an argument, or could some Russian expert have made an argument to Vladimir Putin that nuclear weapons will really get us out of some difficulty we're in, that can there be scenarios? What could they possibly expect by an attack on perhaps an attack on a small NATO country and an attempt to crack NATO with all of the NATO members confronting this idea that General de Gaulle put forward in the 1960s, that the United States would never risk its cities, expose them to nuclear attack just to save European cities.
Right. This is not alien to some of the discussions in Moscow. I don't know whether or not these ideas are seriously considered within the Kremlin, but outside the Kremlin, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in some think tanks, by some people I am familiar with, this discussion is taking place. What if we have to use it? What will be the United States reaction? And the answer that you typically hear is that the United States will not interfere. That the United States strategic doctrine says so, and there is NATO's commitment, Article 5. But when it comes to this, when push will come to shove, the United States will choose not to start a major war with Russia over Europe. That is not comforting for American nuclear strategists, but that's in think tanks community, those who even consider this idea is the dominant thinking. But at the same time, we do not have any evidence that Russia somehow is considering this. By Russia, I mean the Kremlin, somehow is considering the use of nuclear weapons even in Ukraine, let alone in Poland or elsewhere. This is only going to happen if, again, Russia is attacked, and we can have evidence, and we have evidence to the contrary, that Russia, just as the White House at this point, are trying what they can to do what they can to limit this military hostility to the Ukrainian theater and do what they can to make sure that there will be no involvement of NATO, because the White House, certainly President Biden, understands quite well the danger of escalation if somehow there is a no-fly zone imposed. Things can get out of control relatively quickly. And Russians also have the intelligence. They know, for example, how the United States and NATO countries are supplying heavy artillery and tanks to Ukrainian territory where it goes. They could have, in principle, bombed these convoys. They haven't done it yet, in part because I think they are also trying to be very careful not to escalate it further, not to risk a major war with NATO, let alone nuclear war. So far, it's all relatively managed on both sides, but this is not to say that the risks are not there. They're actually quite serious, and the potential for that kind of escalation, unfortunately, is increasing rather than declining. The longer we have this war lasting, the more likely these kind of provocations will take place, and we'll have, before we know it, we will find ourselves in a major military hostility. And this is when perhaps real negotiations will start, because right now there is no sign that either the United States or Russia, for that matter, are trying to reach out to each other and build some grounds for negotiations, for ceasefire, and so forth. They're simply waiting until some results on the ground. Russia believes that its leverage, negotiations leverage, will be increased by the victory over Donbass. The United States is hoping that Ukrainians will make progress and sustain the ground in Donbass, and Russians somehow will understand that enough is enough and will start withdrawing. That's where we are. Unfortunately, political room for negotiations at this point is very limited. And until we see some new developments in Donbass and possibly beyond Donbass, because Russians certainly have plans beyond Donbass, there will be no change.
In the literature that you read and in the discussions you have, your impressions about the Russian perspectives on the questions we're talking about. How do you see Russian opinion about what they're up against in the United States? Do they see the United States as being able to carry out a fairly rational series of deliberations in their own minds about escalation? Or do they think they're up against potential, how shall I put it, loose cannons?
Well, it depends on whom we are talking about, Tony, because certainly we have seen Putin miscalculating on multiple occasions. We have seen Putin being defined in his perception by essentially paranoia of the West, by paranoia of what the United States wants. There is a very firm conviction in the Kremlin, and that includes Vladimir Putin, that includes people such as his Secretary of Security Council, Patrushev, other security services officials. That includes very firm idea that the United States will stop at nothing to do regime change in Moscow. And that's the whole strategy ever since the Orange Revolution, and that's where Putin's thinking began to change as well. Ever since the United States launched, in their perception, this was launched by the West, the Orange Revolution, the United States always wanted to control Eurasia. That's the old tradition of breaking or taking or tearing Ukraine apart from Russia. After that is accomplished, they will go after us. That's why internal opposition inside Russia, people with more or less liberal ideas, are being viewed as a fifth column, being viewed as essentially as the Western, pro-Western opposition, those who are on the payroll of the CIA and the White House. That belief is there. And therefore, whether or not they believe that Biden can be reasoned with, is doubtful. Putin certainly tried in his assessment on multiple occasions to make some sense of these relationships. He tried with George W. Bush, he tried with Barack Obama, he tried with Joe Biden, as you remember, and he tried with Trump. That's a separate story. And all that he has accomplished was essentially crisis, more and more crisis. So that's why I think I'm quite doubtful that he believes that somehow there could be rational discussion with the United States. He certainly sees some people he can have a conversation with, he can have a reasonable dialogue, but whether or not they are able to pursue policies is a separate question, in part because the United States itself now is going through political crisis. There is a polarization. Joe Biden is not popular. He is, up for elections now, midterm elections, and then he's quite old. There will be new elections in 2 years. Who will come to power? We have to see. So I think the conclusion that they have reached in the Kremlin and in many political circles outside the Kremlin is that you cannot have, at this point, you cannot have a rational conversation with the United States. You have to wait until we have a partner on the other side. And in the meantime, you have to do what you can to strengthen Russian power domestically in the former Soviet Union, ideally to build a buffer zone on the Ukrainian territory to protect yourself against NATO encroachment, and then hopefully rebuild relationships with other major powers, rising powers, China, India, and if Europeans will want to come along, France, Germany, and others, then this will be entirely different world order that Russians described as multipolar world order, rather than US-centered hegemony.
These questions are all absolutely fascinating. We could just pursue them into the night, but we haven't got unlimited time, unfortunately. Let me switch over to a topic that's only slightly less tense in its outlines. This whole question of suppose something were to happen to the leadership of Putin. If we accept the idea that the United States wants to see regime change in Russia, what sort of regime change would there actually be? What are they contemplating? What role would the Communist Party have if some change in the polity in Russia were to eventuate?
It's very difficult to answer this question. Obviously, Tony, it's a good question, but I have no evidence whatsoever that the United States is actually.
Yeah, it's not the kind of thing we'd have evidence.
Right, right. We don't know whether or not the United States is after the regime change. Based on the evidence available, this is not the case. Based on what we see in the United States wants change of policy, and it does want to have someone in the Kremlin with whom a conversation will take a very different direction. And it does not believe that Vladimir Putin actually is someone who will be move that conversation in that direction. So, but that does not mean that they want to essentially launch an operation or coup d'etat against Putin. It simply means that they pursue containment strategy again. They wait until there will be change of power. Either Putin resigns for whatever reasons, there are all kinds of speculations, or there is other power change in the Kremlin. They certainly would potentially see fundamental power balance shifting, given the fact that Russia is not winning this war, and if Russia will continue to have major resources drained, economic, political, and military resources, then the Russians will feel it. Then there will be potentially opposition rising against Putin. That's the hope on part of the White House, but that does not mean that they want to remove Putin from power. That kind of evidence I do not see. But if we are to assume that within foreseeable future, 5 years or so, there will be power change in Russia, then that still raises the question, then what? Does the United States have potentially different conversation with Russia? In which direction it will then take Russia? Is Russia going to be a potential partner against the rising China, for example, which is what some of the United States hope? Or is Russia not going to shift in this direction? And what do we do for Russia to shift in this direction, if anything? Do we just expect Russia to be attractive to us because we are the major power in the world? Or do we do something about this? That's the question that, of course, people like Andrei Kissinger have asked before, and there are some in the United States that keep asking this question today. But the question is whether there is elite, intra-elite change in Russia, whether the population, mass public changes in Russia. And we don't know the answer to this question, Tony. I don't know the answer to this question, even though I tried to study this. And that's simply because we have multiple unknowns before us. One big unknown is, of course, the end of this war. You and I don't know how this ends. Because if Russia, for example, is able to secure a considerable part of Ukrainian territory, that's a partition. That's a de facto partition that the West will have somehow to live with. It's a new Cold War in Europe, partitioned Ukraine, and this is a new Iron Curtain, so to speak, across this border. That's one scenario. And that scenario, Putin will be able somehow to sell to the Russian public that we got something out of it. And if Russia is able to rebuild its economy along the way with China and India help, then that's a story that he will be able somehow to tell to the Russians. But if not, if the scenario is very different, and if Russia, in fact, is back to the 90s or to the post-Crimean War, then it's entirely different ballgame. It's entirely different leadership. It's entirely different type of reforms. It's entirely different type of reconstruction of Russia. The answer is indefinite at this point. That's one big unknown, the end of this war. The other unknown is how China will act, whether or not China will actually continue to fully sabotage United States sanctions, or it will actually have to be careful about observing them. In that case, Russia will be even more isolated. So that's not a very good scenario for Russia either. And that raises the question whether Russia will be able to continue the strategy that Putin launched, the strategy of containing the West, or it will shift into some other strategies. And Russians have alternative strategies. One of them that I describe in the book is the strategy of Eurasia, is the strategy of rebuilding yourself in partnership with other Eurasian powers, and in the meantime, allocating resources for domestic state building, and having very limited foreign policy that is more flexible, that is not committed to particular countries for a couple of decades at least, until it's back on its feet, until it has meaningful economy, meaningful military capabilities, hopefully demographic conditions will improve as well. Then Russia will be back to the world politics. This is what Russians did, as you remember, after the Crimean War, and they were ultimately able to regain their power in the Black Sea and to become another major power in the European system. So
they said at the time that they were looking for someone to break up this European order and allow them to reoccupy the Black Sea.
That's right. That's right.
Prince Tsygankov said, "I'm searching for a man to help me in this project," and he found him in Bismarck.
Exactly, he found him in Germany. But remember that Gorchakov also said that Russia is actually a great, powerless country. It has to rebuild itself. It has to be careful now. It has to build special relationships with no one. It will have flexible relationships with France on the one hand, but with Britain on the other. But it will predominantly think about itself. It's possible that Russia will turn in this direction. And in that case, it might actually help Russia to get back on its feet and to recover its capabilities. But again, the judge is, it's difficult to find at this point a final answer because again, the uncertainty is Ukrainian war.
Well, these are fascinating questions, and I would absolutely love to carry on this conversation for 6 or 8 hours. We could go and drink some tea and discuss all these things, and we would still probably not exhaust these big topics. So I guess this is a good place for us to break our conversation off. Perhaps we can continue on another occasion and have a debate. Can you think of somebody you'd like to debate, Andrei, on this topic?
I'll think about this, Tony.
Think
Thanks.
about it. Think about it.
Okay.
It's an interesting thought. Anyhow, we want to thank you, Professor Tsygankov, for sharing your views with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Tony.
Okay, goodbye until next time when Glasnost will continue to ask the question. We've tried everything else. Can we try thinking our way out of this?